I was pretty young when this happened, around 16 or 17, working my first job at a somewhat rundown pizza place. They paid a bit more than other spots, and I made extra from tips during deliveries, so I stuck around for a while. I don't recall much about the start of my shift that night. I probably began at my usual time, around 6 p.m., and was scheduled to work until midnight. The first half of my shift passed like any other, until about 10 p.m. when we got a delivery order. I packed up the food and left to drop it off. The house was in a small neighborhood about 15 minutes away. Finding it was tricky, though, since the trees blocked the house numbers and many homes had long, winding driveways. After circling the area a few times, I finally located the house. I drove down the driveway and parked close to the home. It was one of those old, sprawling houses that seemed like it had been standing for ages. Carrying the food, I made my way up to the front porch. The silence of the neighborhood stood out, so quiet, like I was miles from everything, especially with the thick trees surrounding the area. As I approached the porch, I couldn't help but notice that the front door was wide open. I'd seen people leave their doors cracked before, but this one being completely open fell off. Still, I walked up and knocked before stepping inside to deliver the food, when suddenly, a voice called out, "Hey, would you mind bringing the pizza in? I'm just setting up the table." It was a man's voice, sounding surprisingly friendly. Normally, stepping into someone's home while delivering wasn't a good idea, but his request seemed pretty standard. Something that wouldn't take more than a few seconds and usually led to a decent tip. So, I stepped inside and made my way down the hallway toward the kitchen. I placed the pizza box on the table, but to my surprise, no one else was there. I had just heard his voice, but there was no sign of him anywhere else in the house. The silence was unsettling, completely still, like no other sound existed. A cold shiver ran through me as I noticed the quiet, and just as I began to second-guess myself, his voice echoed again. "Can you bring it in here, please?" This time, his voice came from the hallway on the other side of the kitchen. There was one door ajar, leading to a dark room. No light was on, and it seemed like his voice was coming from just behind the door, like he was standing there out of sight. I stood frozen for a moment, feeling my unease grow. Without another thought, I quickly turned and bolted for the front door. I jumped into my car and sped back to work, keeping the experience to myself. I didn't want to risk being laughed at, either for being too scared or too naive. Looking back now, though, I realized something was definitely off about that encounter. Nothing about it felt normal. I'm just thankful I had enough sense to get out when I did. I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if I had walked into that room with him. At the time, I was 20, working at a small takeout restaurant run by my parents. We specialized in to-go orders. I was juggling college, and my schedule was packed, but my parents had kindly given me a more relaxed role, just helping out with the to-go counter or tidying up after closing. This was early December, and with finals approaching, I had little time for daytime shifts, so I usually took late-night hours. I'd clean for a few hours, then head home. One evening during my shift, about an hour in, I noticed a car parked in our lot. The layout of the restaurant made it easy to spot, as we were in a standalone shop with a small lot in front, with no other businesses nearby. At first, I figured the driver didn't think anyone would mind, and honestly I didn't. About 20 minutes later, the car left. The next night, however, around the same time, the same car pulled in again. The first night, I figured it was a one-off, but seeing it again felt odd. I stepped to the front of the restaurant and glanced outside. It was an older, gray sedan. The car had dark windows, and they didn't seem to be making any effort to conceal themselves. They were parked directly facing the building with their headlights still on. I double-checked that the doors were locked before getting back to work, though it was hard to shake the feeling that they were watching me through the large glass windows. Just like the night before, they left not long after I finished my shift. An hour later, as I walked to my car in the lot, unease settled in. I knew they had driven off, but the fact that the same car appeared 2 nights in a row for no apparent reason was unsettling. I drove home, exhausted, and went to bed, knowing I had a pile of schoolwork waiting. I decided to take the next night off, so I didn't return to work until the following evening. The whole time I was cleaning that night, an anxious tension lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop glancing out the windows, expecting to see that car return at any moment. But it never did. I worked for nearly 3 hours, finishing everything on my list, and by the end of it, I felt a little relieved. Maybe it had all been nothing. I packed up my things, locked the door behind me, and started walking across the parking lot. Just as I reached the middle of the lot, that uneasy feeling returned and a rush of adrenaline shot through me. I began to sweat, scanning my surroundings in every direction. And then, as I was standing out in the open, my eyes caught sight of the car, sitting at the far end of the lot, completely removed from the rest of the spaces. The street lamps flickered on, quickly lighting up the area. Without warning, the car started moving rapidly, heading straight for me. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted toward my own car, but I could hear their tires screeching on the pavement as they sped up, pulling alongside me and slamming on the brakes. I lurched forward, thinking they were going to run me down. I was only a few feet from my car, and then, without warning, their doors flew open. I didn't dare look back. My entire focus was on reaching my car. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard footsteps pounding behind me. I fumbled with the door handle, barely managing to open it and jump inside. Just as I got in, I glanced through the windows. 3 men, wearing masks and hoodies, were running toward me. My hands trembled as I desperately tried to start the engine. The men started slamming their fists against the windows, trying to force the door open, but I managed to get the car in drive and sped off. I tore out of the parking lot and onto the road, finally feeling safe. I immediately dialed 911 and pulled into a nearby gas station, hoping the lights would offer some security as I waited for help. Unfortunately, the exterior of our shop had no cameras, so the police had little to go on. They couldn't even identify the men's faces. After that night, it was no surprise that I never saw the car or those men again. To be honest, I never really understood what they did. I was just there to keep watch. It always struck me as odd that they felt the need for security at all. The office was small and unremarkable, like any other office space, which made my job fairly easy. I didn't have to patrol multiple floors or cover much ground. I'd start my shift at 9 p.m., set up the security alarm system, and then head to the tiny security room where all the camera monitors were. The place only had outdoor cameras, and they weren't exactly high definition. The first few hours of my shift passed slowly, with nothing out of the ordinary happening. But around 1 a.m., I heard what sounded like a latch snapping shut. I sat there, puzzled for a moment, before getting up and opening the door to the hallway. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. There were 3 doors along the hallway, each one closed. I walked over to each, opening them one by one and briefly scanning the rooms. They were filled with office desks, but everything seemed perfectly normal. At this point, I started to wonder if I had misheard the sound. After all, the security systems were supposed to trigger an alarm if anyone had opened one of the main doors to get in. I returned to my room but left the door to the hallway ajar this time, hoping that if the sound happened again, it would be clearer. Settling back into my chair, I resumed my monitoring, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. I kept monitoring the cameras, rechecking the footage from the last few minutes just to make sure I hadn't missed anything. But there was nothing on the screens, no movement outside the building. Another 20 minutes passed, and I started to relax a bit, no longer paying as close attention. Then, a sound echoed down the hallway. It was soft but unmistakable, a door creaking open slowly. I shot up from my chair, my heart pounding, and walked toward the hallway, not fully believing what I'd heard. I instantly noticed that one of the doors was slightly ajar, something I knew shouldn't have happened without an alarm going off or any movement appearing on the cameras. Confusion washed over me as I approached the open door cautiously. I pushed it open a bit further, revealing a shadowy office space. I stepped inside, straining my eyes to see, but there was no sound, no movement, nothing. I began to move slowly, glancing around the room past each office desk. Then, as I reached the back, I caught a glimpse of something shifting against one of the walls, a shadow perhaps. My eyes followed it, and before I could react, I turned my head just in time to lock gazes with a person crouching beneath one of the desks. It was a man, his black hair hanging limply around his face, and dark circles rimmed his eyes. His expression combined fear and rage, as though he were furious and terrified that I'd found him. The instant our eyes met, he began to rise. I had no idea whether he was armed or what his intentions were, so my hand instinctively shot to my side, readying myself. My instincts kicked in, and I sprinted down the hallway, out the front doors. The security alarms blared, immediately alerting the police. I kept my eyes on the entrance as I distanced myself, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was coming next. It took barely 30 seconds before the door swung open, and the man bolted out of the building. He dashed around the corner, disappearing from view, and I lost track of him completely. When the officers arrived, we pulled the footage from the night surveillance, hoping to find something that could explain what had happened. But there was no sign of the man entering the building. We couldn't figure out when or how he had gotten inside. The question still lingered. Why had he broken in? After speaking with the company, they claimed to have no idea about the intruder, and nothing seemed to be missing. But I had my suspicions. They had hired a security guard for their small office, something that didn't make much sense unless there was a reason behind it. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. My guess was that the man was an ex-employee, someone a little unstable. I stayed on for a few more months before deciding to leave for a better opportunity. To this day, I've never learned what really happened that night.